All righty. Well, we want to get started. This is the Life of Samson, part one, and this is our sermon review for this particular lesson. Now, beloved, I have been engaged in a series primarily from the book of Judges. We've been talking about Gideon for the last 5, maybe even 6 weeks, looking at Gideon. I don't want to abandon the book of Judges because I want to transition from the life of Gideon to whom is perhaps considered the most popular judge in all of the Old Testament, and that certainly would be Samson. He is a hero type. As I said on Sunday, for me, he had a ranks right there with Batman, Superman, Hercules, and other superheroes of the past. And again, by way of review, there are several leadership typologies that we have in the Old Testament, beginning with the patriarchs like Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then ending with prophets like Zephaniah, Hananiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Isaiah. And then we have kings like Saul, Solomon, and David. But then we have this grouping of leaders. They're not kings, they're not patriarchs, they're not prophets, but they are individuals that God specifically chose to use to deliver the children of Israel from the hands of those who have oppressed them, primarily because they, the people, have continued to do wrong in the eyes of God. Now, in the case of Gideon, it was the Midianites. And God used the Midianites to reprimand and to punish the children of Israel because, again, they had done evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so let's kind of take a look. From the time that I was a child, Samson has been one of my favorite stories of the Bible. I've already said to you that I rank Samson right alongside Batman, Superman, Hercules, and most recently, the Black Panther. And so Samson is not just a prophet, he's not just a preacher, he's not just a priest, he's not just one who is involved in sharing the news of the Lord, but he is a superhero and he is a deliverer. And he guards against and protects the children of Israel, as we will see, from a insidious group of people called the Philistines. I don't want to jump too far ahead. I always put Samson in the category with Superman, Batman, Hercules, and any of the other popular heroes that we are familiar with. Now, before examining in detail the story of Samson, let's take a quick moment to review what has happened to Israel since the Gideon story. What I'm trying to say to you is that the Bible does not take us immediately from the close of Gideon to the opening of the Samson story. There are several other episodes and narratives that take place between the two. And if we're going to fully appreciate even the Samson story, we need to at least make reference and acknowledge some of the other stories that take place, again, between Gideon in chapter 6 and chapter 7, and Samson that begins in chapter 13. First, there is this tragic story where the sons of Gideon are mass murdered in order that Abimelech might become king over God's people. Now, Abimelech bears a striking resemblance to some of the political figures that we see here and experience even today. Gideon was such a favored leader of the children of Israel until it was assumed that once he died and moved off the scene, watch where I'm going, beloved, that the leadership of the people of God, of the children of Israel, would fall into the hands of one of his many sons. Now, Gideon had 70 sons, and Abimelech was fearful that the leadership of the people would fall to one of these 70 sons of Gideon. And so he convinced his own particular tribe, the Shechemites, to rally with him. And he arranged, watch this, he arranged for the mass murder of these 70 sons of Jerubbaal, who is also known as Gideon. Why? so that he might remove them as a political threat, and that might clear the way for him to serve as king. There is this interesting story about a thorn bush being made king of the forest, and that was used in a metaphoric kind of way, and to illustrate just how unhappy the children of Israel would be if they indeed followed Abimelech. I've already said, and I won't be too specific lest I clash church and state, but the attitude, the insecurity, the ego of Abimelech reminds us of some of the political figures as recently as last night who have come on the scene and have sought to make themselves the leader over the rest of us here in the country. This story, however, assumes that the leader following Gideon would be one of his sons. Now, that's based upon primogeniture, which was the Old Testament belief and practice, beloved, that the next king or leader would be the son or the seed of the previous king. Primo, first, geniture, to be born. So the first to be born was in line, watch this, to inherit the throne, or in this case, the leadership of God's people. And so this story assumes that Gideon would be followed by one of his sons according to the practice of primogeniture, instead of a person chosen by God, which is charismatic choice, which seems to be the preferred platform at the time. And here's what I'm saying, that when you investigate the entirety of the book of Judges, you do not find instances where the next leader is the son or the seed of the previous leader. Now, we do see that with Saul, and then David, who was followed by Solomon, and then Solomon is followed by Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And so primogeniture is that practice there. And then, of course, the Abrahamic seed, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that leadership falls to one of the sons and the seed of the previous generation. But what I want you to see here is that when it comes to the book of Judges, there seems to be a denial of this practice of primogeniture, where the leader is selected because of who his father was. In the case of Gideon, he is selected by God. That's charismatic choice. In the case of Ehud, he is selected by God. That is charismatic choice. In the case of Deborah, she is selected by God. That is charismatic choice. Shamgar is selected by God. That is charismatic choice. And what we will see tonight is that the leader that we're going to discuss, Samson, was not chosen because his father was, Manoah was a king or a leader, but he was chosen specifically by God, again, as a practice, get this, beloved, as a practice of charismatic choice. This further illustrated by the fact that the next three leaders or judges of Israel, watch this, Tola, Jair, and Jephthah, are all men whose father had not been leaders of Israel. So the book of Judges, beloved, is punctuated with stories of individuals who rise to prominence, rise to notoriety, rise to the ranks of leadership, not because of their pedigree, not because of their family, but because they were found to be pleasing in the eyesight of God. Now, the Old Testament continues to bounce between these two typologies, primogeniture on one hand, and then charismatic choice on the other hand. Again, primogeniture means that you're the king because your daddy was the king, or you're the leader because your daddy was the leader. Charismatic choice argues that God has the ability to select you regardless of your pedigree, regardless of your background, regardless of your circumstance, but because you are the apple of God's eye. Saul was selected by charismatic choice. He sought to put his son on the throne. Of course, that did not work, and he was replaced by David. David puts his son Solomon on the throne. That is primogeniture. So when we survey, especially the Old Testament, beloved, we see instances and examples where leadership is determined either by primogeniture or charismatic choice. Now, the reason I bring this to your attention is because when we get to the New Testament, there is a hint or there is a remnant of this thinking as it relates to who God is going to view as his new chosen people. Will it be the seed of David or the Jews? Or is God going to choose those who choose to believe in him? So we're the children of God, not because of our pedigree, not because of our ancestry, not because we are the direct biological descendants of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, but because we, the just, shall live by faith. We are God's chosen people, not by pedigree, not by family, not by primogeniture, but by charismatic choice. God has chosen us. Why? Because we have chosen God. So it's very, very important, beloved, that you understand this distinction and this difference, and that you celebrate charismatic choice as opposed to primogeniture, because our covenant and our relationship with God is via charismatic choice as opposed to primogeniture. We are God's people, but we weren't born into that line. We were chosen into that line because we have chosen to keep covenant with God. These stories are followed by the criticism of the Ephraimites, who complained that they were not included in the call up to fight against the Ammonites. That's another one of the stories that take place in this interim between Gideon on one side and Samson on the other side. And of course, the point of that story about the Ephraimites and them complaining that they were not included in the fight is because God wanted to get the credit for the victory. He did not want the Ephraimites, watch this, or anyone else to claim that the victory and the success of God's people was because of the particular people that were chosen to fight. But victory was final because it was in the hands of God. There are people who will take credit for your victory, but don't want responsibility or blame for your failure. Haven't we seen that in recent days where certain individuals, and I will call no names, that if the 21 or 22 people whom he endorsed and whom he had nominated, if they had won, he would have been all too anxious, all too quick to take credit for their victory. But because they failed and because they did not win, he doesn't want to bear any responsibility for their loss or their failure at the voting polls. That's kind of the story of the Ephraimites fighting against the Ammonites. God did not want them to claim victory for God did not want them to claim victory over the Ammonites because he knew they would not take responsibility for the failure if there had been a failure against the Ammonites. I tell you, the more I look at the word of God, the more I see current circumstances repeated today that were first initiated in the word of God and in the Bible. And then I want to close with this. Jephthah makes the point that his victory came from God's hands and not from the help he did or did not get from the Ephraimites. And of course, the tragedy of the story of Jephthah is that he makes this promise, he makes this covenant with God, that if you give me this victory over the Ammonites, then I will sacrifice whomever I first see upon my return from the victory. And when he gains this victory on the battlefield and comes home, it is his daughter who runs out, embraces her father and meets him And Jephthah realizes that the promise that he had made to God has to be fulfilled with the death and the sacrifice of his own daughter. Now, I invite you to take a look. Chapter 9, chapter 10, chapter 11, chapter 12, and there you will find all of these interim or intermediate stories between Gideon and Samson. I make mention of them because I don't want you to assume that the Bible writer of Judges is making this enormous leap from one character, Gideon, into the birth of another character by the name of Samson. We have Tola, we have Jair, we have Jephthah. Those stories, we have the story of Abimelech, and then there are actually three others that emerge. They are given in rapid succession. Their careers are mentioned, but there's not a lot of verses devoted to their serving as judges, other than to mention that indeed they were judges. And these three judges include Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. So you have Tola, you have Jair, you have Jephthah, you have the story of Abimelech, and then you have these other three stories, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. Again, there's not a lot of material, maybe one or two verses each. One or two verses are devoted to each of these characters. But again, beloved, it illustrates how time and time again, over and over again, as God delivers them, sends them a rescuer, sends them a deliverer, there is a period of peace and prosperity, and then the people go right back to doing what it is that caused them to cry out to God in the first place. We find that with Jair, we find it with Tola, we find it with Ibzan, we find it with Elon, we find it with Abdon, we find it with Jephthah. There is this reoccurring pattern. So that when we see the same thing happening when we arrive to chapter 13 of the book of Judges, we're not surprised, we're not alarmed, because this has been a recurring and a repeating practice of the people time and time again. And again, the children of Israel did evil in the eyes of God. It seems that in the case of Ibzan, we see the early case where Israelites are given marriage to persons outside their tribe, outside their own people. Now, I mention this because what becomes prominent and a central issue in the story of Samson that we're launching this series on, part of the problem is Samson is not content, nor is he willing to confine his marital adventures to his own people, but he insists on going to other people. Well, this whole idea, this appetite for somebody other than your own is not started with Samson. We can go all the way back to Ibzan and see that in the time of Ibzan, daughters were given to foreign men, and sons were oftentimes married to foreign women. So this practice, this appetite, this appeal to find somebody who's not in your village, not in your tribe, not of your people, does not start with Samson. Now, it becomes an enormous problem with Samson, but it doesn't begin with Samson. It actually starts in this story of Ibzan, which is another reason that perhaps you want to review chapters 9 through 12 and take a look at some of these other stories, because you will see in these other stories a signal and a glimpse of what is going to become a severe problem in the life of Samson. This establishes a precedent, beloved, and signals what we would later find in the life of Samson, where he married outside of his tribe. Now, I don't want to give away all the details because I'm going to be in this series for the next several weeks, but Delilah is not the only woman that Samson married. Actually, Samson had multiple marriages, and he even had liaisons that he did not honor with marriage. He had at least 2 wives and a live-in girlfriend, or a girlfriend that he used to spend the night with. And these are 3 different characters. But what all three of these females, get this, beloved, what all three of these females have in common is that they're not from the tribe of Dan. They're not amongst Samson's people. They are all members of the Philistine community, which meant that Samson had to go outside his own tribe, outside his own village, outside of his own people to find these females that he was keeping company with. And I also want to write here that in part, I'm being a little theological here, that in part, the book of Judges was written in part to warn God's people against being too adventurous in terms of finding a mate or finding someone to be with in terms of starting a family. Now, I know that we have all kinds of latitude and all kinds of flexibility and all kinds of freedom. And, you know, there was a time when miscegenation was not allowed. It was illegal in this country. And Black men could not marry white women could not marry Black men. And the racial codes in this country were very well defined and they were rigid. Well, that has been relaxed and we're far more lenient today and our attitudes are altogether different. But if there is a lesson that the Bible is at least hinting at, even if we don't practice it and we don't enforce it today, there is this notion in the corridors of the Old Testament that, and I think what I really want to say here is that while I'm not arguing that marrying outside your tribe or marrying outside your community, marrying outside your neighborhood, marrying outside your people is necessarily wrong, I think what the Bible is saying here is that if you don't have something in common, primarily in common with the person that you hook up with, you're going to have problems. Now, it is illustrated in the story of Samson and in the story of Ibzan that this lack of having something in common with your spouse or your significant other was because they were from a different tribe, a different community, a different culture. What subtly the Bible is saying here is that as you fuel your appetite for company, make sure that it is somebody that you have something in common with so that there will be longevity to your relationship, because the absence of having something in common very well can end up in disaster. Now, again, I don't want to get ahead of myself because we have a long way to go with this story of Samson. But here at the seed, here at the core, here at the basis, here at the foundation is this Old Testament notion that one ought to have something in common with those that they're going to spend significant time with. And I will confess that that has changed, or our ability to find something in common is no longer restricted to racial identity. We can find something in common with just about everybody, and we're such an eclectic people and we're such an international people until you can find something in common with a person from China, a person from Korea, a person from Russia, a person from almost anywhere. But the important thing, and the point that I'm making here on the basis of this passage of scripture, is that you very well ought to have something in common that will cement and hold you together as glue, because romance is not a permanent attitude and outlook. So the story repeats the other Old Testament story that includes Sarah and the mother of Samuel. What I want to say here is that in addition to it being a continuation of this new practice introduced by Ibzan of taking literally foreign women into the custody of your marriage, there is also a repeat of the story that is first introduced to us with Abraham and Sarah. Sarah not being able to have children and God allowing her to have a child to bless her in her old age. The same thing goes on with the mother of Samuel, Hannah, who is able to conceive a child even beyond her childbearing years. And I said on Sunday that while the name of Samson's mother, even though we are told his father, while the name of Samson's mother is not revealed to us. What she has in common with these other women in the Old Testament is that, like them, even though she was beyond her childbearing years and she was childless, barren, and thought not to be able to have children, God blessed her with a child that would rise up and be the deliverer of the children of Israel from the Philistines who were oppressing them. And then I think I want to close with this as it relates to the early portion of the story of Samson. This chapter 13 identifies the conditions under which he is birthed, the oddity and the awkwardness of him being born to a woman who was both barren and childless. She had never had any children, and it was thought that she could not have children because her womb was not productive. And notice that the angel or the messenger says to her, do not drink any strong drink, any wine, anything that is fermented, and don't eat any unclean item. Now you go to the book of Leviticus, and there's a whole listing of animals that are thought to be unclean because of their hoofs and whether the hoofs were cleft or not cleft. Certainly pork and other such animals were outlawed and were thought to be unclean. And it is because the angel predicts to the mother of Samson that Samson is going to be a Nazirite. Now, I want to pause here and I want to make this plain because there is a goodly amount of confusion. And those of you who have read through the Bible and you're familiar with biblical vocabulary, there are two terms that are easily confusing, and that is a Nazirite and a Nazarene. Now, the two terms are admittedly similar to each other. However, there is a major distinction between the two, and it is easy to confuse them. When I was growing up, I always believed and thought that the reason Jesus wore long hair was because he was a Nazarene. And of course, the Nazarene was not allowed to put a razor to his head. Well, that's because, like so many others, beloved, I was confusing a Nazirite with a Nazarene. Let me explain to you the difference before I let you go this evening and turn you back into the hands of Pastor. A Nazarene was any person who either was born or grew up in Nazareth. So a Nazarene was a citizen of Nazareth. Jesus was called Jesus of Nazareth. He spent his early childhood where? In Nazareth. So Jesus was called and considered a Nazarene because he grew up in Nazareth. What made him a Nazarene was that he grew up in Nazareth. A Nazirite has nothing to do with where you live, nothing to do with where you were born, and nothing to do with where you grew up. A Nazirite is based upon, again, the book of Leviticus. It is what is called, beloved, the holiness code. These were individuals who had a special behavior that sealed their covenant and their relationship with God. And so they would not eat meat, they would not eat strong drink, they would not drink wine, they would not allow a razor to be placed on their head. So they had long hair, they had beards, because they were in covenant not to do those things that would impede the growth of their hair or even their diet. Again, it has nothing to do with where you were born, where you grew up, where your home was, your home address. It had to do with your submission to a holiness code. Now, we do have evidence and we do know that Jesus was called a Nazarene, but he was not a Nazirite. A Nazirite is a whole different category. However, we do know that when the Apostle Paul returned to Jerusalem after his second missionary journey, and he had been preaching something that was slightly different than what the apostles had been preaching. It was the Apostle James that demanded that Paul go to the temple and perform the acts that would make him a Nazirite, that he would subject himself to the practices and the ritual, washing your head a certain kind of way, bowing a certain kind of way, praying a certain kind of way, that he would subject himself to the ritual that would make him a Nazirite. That's where we find a Nazirite in the New Testament. Now, it is when he goes to the temple and when he does so, and he's recognized by certain Jews who are adverse to him, that he is taken, he is beaten, and he is rescued by soldiers who think that he is Hezekiah the bandit, one of the other characters who had claimed to be a Messiah, and they arrest him. But it is his arrest that actually saved him from the mob that would have killed him otherwise. But the reason he was in the presence of the mob in the first place is because he was participating in and he was undergoing the ritual and the ceremony of becoming a Nazirite, which for James reinforced and illustrated to everybody that Paul was a Hebrew of the Hebrews and a Jew of the Jews. Remember, Paul had begun to argue and had begun to preach that you didn't have to be Jewish to enjoy the blessings of the Lord. So when he returns to Jerusalem and he's back in the company with these Jewish leaders, James, the brother of Jesus being one, they were anxious to prove and demonstrate that Paul's preaching out there about not having to be Jewish was a passing fancy. And they wanted the people in Jerusalem to be reassured that Paul, who was a member of their group, was as devout, devoted, and dedicated to being a Jew as any other Jew who had now taken on the label of Christianity. Now, I know I've gone off in a few tangents in that regard, but I've tried to put it in context so that you would understand and appreciate the difference between a Nazarene, somebody from Nazareth, and a Nazirite, someone who is submitted to a holiness code based upon the book of Leviticus. Well, friends, that takes up all of my time. I certainly want to thank you for yours. And this is the first of several installments that I will be doing on the life of Samson. I've used this evening to merely introduce Samson to you, give you the conditions and the circumstances of his birth. I am so excited, and I hope that you'll join me these remaining weeks as we talk more and more about Samson, his involvement with these foreign women, his access to power and strength, his interaction with the Philistines, and the outcome of his life. God bless you all. Pastor, we're back in your hands.